What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Horsepower Obsessed. Welcome back to the vlog. Thanks for pressing play. Today we are joined with Joe. You guys remember him. He actually just recently took delivery of a C8 Corvette ZR1. Yeah, the big dog, the king. And we're here to talk to him about what his experience was with it in detail. Now, if you guys saw the Monday night video we did, I think 2 weeks ago, we talked to Joe about his delivery and about some of his first impressions. But now we're going to get more in detail with it because there's a lot of stuff to unpack with this car. And even though Joe didn't get to drive it for a long period of time, there's a lot you notice right off the bat because he has driven a C8 Stingray. Actually, he owned a Stingray, and he has driven a C8 Z06 as well. So getting into a C8 ZR1, what's the difference? What are all the differences? We're going to talk all about them today. So let's welcome Joe to the channel.
Hey, Justin.
How are you, Joe?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So the first thing I want to talk about is where you picked up the car from. If you guys remember, I did a video with Joe not too long ago talking about the fact that he was going to get a C8 Corvette ZR1 and he was going to get it at MSRP. We had to do a video to make it so everybody stood by their word, but ultimately his dealership did honor that MSRP price and he did get it at MSRP. Everybody went home happy. So what dealership was that, Joe?
It was Schumacher in Little Falls, New Jersey, around since the early 30s.
So Joe has done a bunch of business with them, and they did decide to go ahead and give him the car at MSRP because that was what was initially agreed upon. So big thumbs up to them for honoring their word on that. Joe got the car, and we're going to show pictures all throughout this video. I'm going to pop pictures in of his actual car. Beautiful Seawolf gray, red calipers, two-tone black and red interior. When Joe went to grab it, he actually got us a cold start video, and we're going to put that in right here. Now, Joe, tell me, after the cold start, and especially after you drove it, tell me what you had told me off camera about the sound.
Yeah, so I picked it up with my dad, and my dad and I had been in the Z06 the day before, and, I obviously have driven several thousand miles in Z06's testing, products in my other part-time job, which is solar performance. And so, I know the sound pretty clearly, and I was surprised that my dad, who was literally, up here for 2 weeks and only been in the Z06 a handful of times, the first thing when we pulled out of the dealership, literally doing about 35, 45 before we got to the first light, he said to me, "It's quieter." And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, you took the words out of my mouth. And he said, "Yeah, it sounds like a more normal car." And just so we're on the same page, I was in Z mode. And for those of you that drive your Z06 in the Z mode, I think maybe absent track, it is probably the loudest and most exhilarating sound that the Z06 makes. And so apples to apples, driving the ZR1, coming out of there in Z mode, which I did, and driving, 95% of my drives in the Z06 are always in Z mode. It really was apropos that we were both easily able to distinguish that. So that was very interesting.
So this is something we've talked about a lot of the channel, guys, is that the twin turbos of the ZR1 are going to muffle the sound. There's just no way around it. The turbo acts as a giant muffler, basically. So it's going to make the exhaust quieter. Now, we've heard some of them down at the bash, and I'll try to put that clip in here of I think it was a Rapid Blue ZR1 I heard when it revved. It sounded amazing. Oh, and another one. But here's the problem with that. That's revving. We've all heard the Z06 at full rev. You could put Sport Cats or Cat Deletes on a Z06 and make that thing just sound absolutely insane. The ZR1 is never going to sound that good mod for mod. It's just not going to. The turbos are going to muffle it. Now, outside of the turbos muffling it, Joe actually had another opinion on what could also be muffling it, which I didn't really give too much thought to. But Joe, tell us about the other thing that you thought might be muffling that sound.
Yeah, so, the coupe being the split window, there literally are those those horizontal, vents through the glass that are allowing, heat obviously is primary reason they're there. We all know, but you're also letting sound out. And when you think about a Z06 coupe with a solid piece of glass, you've got the engine noise kind of reverberating or at least bouncing off glass, sort of like, speakers do when you're playing music off of glass.
Yep.
And so all that's gone. And so, it made me think about when you're in the Z06 and you're hearing that sound, some of it is clearly exhaust and some of it is probably, that great sounding in Z mode in particular of the shifts and the sound of the engine itself, which would be reduced by having that sound escaping, through an open chamber as opposed to reflecting and being literally trapped within a compartment. And that compartment is obviously sealed, with glass across the whole back window.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I never really gave that any thought until we talked about that initially, and then I was like, yeah, you know what? There's probably a couple factors at play here, but the biggest one, of course, is going to be the turbos. Not to make it sound like the ZR1 sounds bad by any means, because it definitely doesn't, but it's just not, if you're used to the Z06, it's not going to sound like that.
If someone is, not as familiar with the Z06 and gets into, the ZR1, and obviously with 1,064 horsepower and all the fanfare that it's out there, and rightfully so, it's going to feel disappointing to somebody from a sound perspective, is the comment I made, because it's hard to imagine that this car is the animal that it is, and it sounds pretty low key.
Yeah.
Well, that's just driving it.
That's actually going to factor into something else we're going to talk about here in a second. The sounding kind of low key. But one of the things I wanted to touch on really quickly in the beginning here in this video was something we talked about off camera, is the fact that you lose the frunk. Now, obviously, you guys already know you're losing the frunk on the ZR1. There's no way around it. There's a pass-through cooling option, and that is really there to cool those turbos. Those are two pretty big intercoolers right in the center of the car, and that air now comes up over the hood to act as an additional downforce for the front end. But what I didn't give any thought to, again, was something that Joe brought up, and it's that because you're losing that frunk, you're also losing the ability to plug in a battery tender. So, yeah, I mean, I never thought about it, but without that outlet there in the front, which is of course gone with the frunk, the only other option now is to remove all of the plastic underneath there and connect a battery tender the old-fashioned way with like alligator clips or something on the positive and negative terminal. So kind of an interesting thing to lose, considering especially the 2025s, they're probably not going to get driven that much. So now you're not going to have a real easy way to put it on a battery tender, and this was Joe's idea. I totally didn't even think about it.
Yeah, when I opened the frunk, just knowing from the base car, obviously the Z06, and then this, I immediately looked to the left to see or the charge area, and it doesn't exist. And I'm like, interesting. So we knew they moved the camera, and then I'm trying to figure out where they moved that to, only to find out that it doesn't look like they moved it anywhere except, as you just said, back to the old-fashioned way. So I don't know if in 26 and beyond, that'll be different. But I guess time will tell.
So you kind of mentioned there for a second the other thing we want to talk about, which is the rear view mirror camera being moved. They moved the camera from on top of the rear hatch to now down by the license plate area where your typical backup camera was. Now, one thing I wanted to know, I asked Joe off camera again, I said, did you notice a difference in the placement of that? And ultimately he said no. Like, somehow then moving that camera down, I mean, that has to be well over 12 inches lower. And somehow GM is still making it look very similar to the way it did when it was up on the hatch. Now, this does a couple things. This gets rid of the potential blockage of your rear view camera because of that giant ZTK wing, but there's got to be more to it, because I don't think the wing alone is the reason they moved that. And Joe and I were speculating off camera. Joe actually came up again with something I didn't think about, is that it's likely because of the split window. Because now if you turn off that rear view camera mirror, because some people don't like it. I've talked to a bunch of people that absolutely hate it. And if you turn that off, your rear view visibility is going to be very limited, because half of that window is cut out with the split window setup. So now you wouldn't really be able to see anything. So maybe that's why they moved.
And I wonder, we were talking, you and I, if there's maybe some sort of regulation around visibility out a rear window in terms of, space. Because I know that I had learned over the years, you ever notice some of the visors in the front, come down,
Yeah, they're
and
real
on
small.
some cars like convertibles, they're like this, and the window's small, and you're thinking, why would you even make
Why even
one?
bother?
It
Yep.
does nothing. And the answer is because apparently there's a reg that when it's down, there has to be a certain amount of visibility that is present. And I wonder if, that's one of the issues that happened when they put that split window app leak or whatever you want to call it. And to your point, it does take up a large percentage of the overall glass.
So earlier you said the sound of the car was more like a normal car. I like that word, by the way. Your dad said it was more like a normal car. Thus implying the Z06 is just crazy. But the fact that the sound was more of a normal car and just kind of giving you that more laid back feel. Tell us a little bit about the drivability of it. Like 1,064 horsepower, it's going to be wild, right?
Yeah, I was very, very anxious to answer that even to myself by pulling out and driving away and getting to the first light, accelerating after the first light, and then, doing 55 or 60 on not a highway, but like, a side road, if you will. And it's very, very, very Z06-esque. There is not, if you were blindfolded, you'd be hard pressed to know that the acceleration or anything had really changed. Now, I guess on one hand, it's not, shocking because you're really not engaging, turbos at any point. But, there is that just obvious thought of, okay, at 1,064, will the pedal experience have a faster point of acceleration? And it actually really does not. So yeah, that's confirmed. I was wondering and now confirmed that it's a very approachable car, just like the Z06 is driving around town. If anyone's scared that having 1,064 and not racing it or not really getting into it, it's still going to be a very frightful drive. Absolutely not the case. You could drive this car all day long locally, and most people driving with you, by the way, if you said to them, if I unleash this beast, it's 1,064, until you, I guess, do it, they probably won't believe you, honestly.
Yeah. So in the early reviews of the ZR1, a lot of the engineers were actually talking to different YouTubers and stuff, and they had actually mentioned the same thing, and they used the same word, that the 1,064 horsepower, that they had made it very approachable, meaning you're not going to get in this car and not be able to drive it. So even with 1,064 horsepower, guys, if you haven't seen this yet, Paragon Performance actually just dynoed the car, and the car is dynoing at the wheels 1,028. So odds are very good GM has underrated this engine, and the fact that it's super easy to drive at what appears to possibly be as high as 1,100 horsepower, maybe even a hair more at the crank, is just incredible. GM in the grand scheme of their powerful cars, I mean, the C7 ZR1, the C8 Z06, when you get behind the wheel of those cars, 755 horsepower and 670 horsepower is not exactly anything to scoff at either. And those cars are extremely approachable as well. So I assumed GM would do the same here with the C8 ZR1. Just to put it into perspective, that's roughly 400 more horsepower than the C8 Z06. So the fact that they made that manageable still is really, really quite something else in its own right. But to really manage all of that, manage it in a way that's going to be good for the track, I should say, is going to bring us to our next point, and that is ride comfort. Now, obviously, the car that we're looking at here that Joe picked up is a ZTK package car. It's not just the high wing or aero package car. It is ZTK. So that means stiffer suspension, Sport Cup 2R tires, and the big wing and aggressive aero. So with all of that said, we've heard the engineers from GM talk about the fact that the ZTK package car is roughly comparable to the Z07 package Z06, meaning the suspension's pretty aggressive and it's built for the track, so it's going to beat you up a little bit. Now, Joe, the Z06 that he has spent time in is a non-Z07 package car, so tell us how you felt about the differences between the two suspensions you're used to.
Yeah, that difference is significant, and one of the very things you notice pulling out, and driving even that first quarter mile, half mile, similar to the way you notice the sound, that was almost instantaneously noticeable as you hit a bump, or even, you can feel yourself going left to right, whereas, in Z mode or even touring, because I even put the ZR1 in touring thinking, okay, that'll counter a lot of that. It makes it slightly better, but it's still a very noticeable difference between a non-ZTK Z06 for sure. So you won't mistake the differences for sure.
So the only other real thing to talk about, there's a couple little things we'll talk about after this, but for the most part, the interior, 100% identical minus a ZR1 badge on the bottom of the steering wheel instead of a Z06 or an E-Ray badge. Other than that, that's pretty much it, right?
Exactly. It was sort of a non-factor for me getting in the car and a little bit, almost a little bit unexciting. And, picking up a ZR1, of course, you want to be excited every inch of every way. And, sitting in it and looking around, be like, yep, know this car well. Even the sales rep joked, he said, I take you through the tour, but frankly, I haven't even had my ZR1 training yet. You could probably teach me a few things.
Right. So the only other thing I wanted to mention was some pictures that Joe had sent me initially whenever he first was picking up the car. Is he shared 2 pictures of the driver's side and passenger side skirt. And whenever he shared the picture with me, I looked at it and I said, how does that happen? And of course, I'll put the pictures up here on the screen where it very clearly looks like the side skirt is cracked. And the passenger side and driver's side both look like they're cracked on the exact same location, which in my head goes, well, that happened when they were loading the car on the truck, of course, because that's how that would happen. And then the more I got to talking to Joe, because he sent it to me originally, he was super mad about it. Like, brand new car, $200,000+, and the side skirts are cracked. Like, this is just ridiculous. And then the next day or so, we reconnected about it, and he told me that that's actually protective film. So I wouldn't want to say expel, but something like a paint protection film that they're putting on just the front there to make sure that the side skirt doesn't get beat up from the rocks from the front tires, which I think is a great idea. I think they could implement it a little bit better here, but it's just funny to how much that looks like a crack.
Yeah.
Joe, like tell them how you felt when you saw that.
Yeah. So I had a few friends from my Corvette club who asked if they could come along for the pickup. And, I made sure the dealership was comfortable with it. And this is just a shout out to TJ. TJ is the sales rep I've dealt with there for, more than two and a half decades now. And he's just a champ. And, he let me, have fun with the car, looking at every little spot. And, I kind of ran to get him because I was like panicked that I found these cracks. And, I looked at him with my cell phone, and those are the shots I sent you, Justin. And then he's like, no way. He goes, I got to see this. So he came down the steps with me. And as he came back down the steps to look at the car, one of my friends there said, I got good news. I'm like, what's that? He goes, it's not a crack. I said, what is it? And he had like this high-powered flashlight that I guess he had gotten from his car, because the lights are pretty good, but down low, they're not so good, Right. And he turned it on, and I looked, and he goes, it's exactly the same on the other side. Come around the other side. And I looked, and I said, okay, well, there's no way they could be identical. And then as I saw and started touching the edge, you could see that it was sort of a semicircle wrap that in the light of the iPhone literally looked like a crack.
Yeah.
Well,
even those pictures, I thought that was a crack. Yeah.
And believe me, TJ and I could not have been more elated to recognize that. Yeah. So, yeah.
Another thing I wanted to touch on real quick is the engine builder for this particular ZR1 is Shane Parker, which I thought was really cool when Joe sent me this, because that's the same guy who built David DBM Racing's Z06 engine. Now, on that same note, Joe told me whenever he popped the hatch to take a look at the engine, how kind of underwhelmed he was by the size of the intake. So obviously it's kind of powder coated or painted a nice blue to match the whole ZR1 theme. But as you can see in this picture, it is kind of underwhelming. It doesn't quite fill up that area the way that the Z06 intake does. The reason for that, I actually knew this before Joe had mentioned it to me, is that the engineers flat out said there's not as much air volume needed on the ZR1 because of the turbos as there was with the Z06. So the Z06 needed a much bigger intake than the ZR1. I'm pretty sure they said 58% smaller on the ZR1 than it is on the Z06. And I thought that was pretty incredible.
Yeah,
so
that was the very noticeable, opening that hatch for the first time. And of course, I'd seen the pictures, of the blue, engine. So there was no shock there. But the pictures, I think, made it look not as small, if you will. And then in person, you were like, wow, that is surprising. And frankly, some of my buddies stood around and we looked at each other and we were kind of thinking back to, hey, this almost looks like a V6 Camaro cover from, 2010, 11, 12 with the RS. and frankly, even a little bit smaller. And you know, on one hand, kudos, because you've got a real sleeper on your hand. If somebody opens that, they'd never dream it's let alone a V8, but a 1064 V8. So not necessarily a terrible thing, but again, in that realm of definitely noticeable, it is. And then I noticed from, you know, obviously my solar background, I noticed that the throttle bodies are much more accessible, which is great news. But they also appeared to be smaller. And I thought to myself, my eye's gotten pretty good these days. And I'm like, those, I don't even think those are 87s. And it turns out that they're not. And again, this goes back to your point about, you know, needing less air, but it also makes the same point that the Z06 and everything that GM and other manufacturers do. And that is that, you know, they get their throttle bodies from AC Delco in the case of GM. And, you know, AC Delco makes a whole bunch of varying sizes, and GM doesn't really have to architect or build the engine from that point on in the sense of size. They can get all their gains, you know, past the throttle body. And that's why their throttle bodies tend to be fairly generic looking. They're not ported. They're not the prettiest things. They don't need to be. But the same question I get is, will there be gains to be had and better acceleration off the line by having a bigger throttle body, you know, in that engine? And the answer is, according to our engineers, absolutely, for all the same reasons. And then we did a little bit of research, and we found out that the throttle bodies that they're likely using happen to be throttle bodies that AC Delco makes that exact size for other vehicles. And therefore, just like they chose to use the 87s for the Z06, they also chose to use the 87s in the base 495, and they also use the 87s in the C7. So again, you've got some economies of scale at work in that sense.
So as far as the brakes, tires, rotors, wheel setups are concerned, this particular car was outfitted with the forged ZR1 wheel in black. And you can see from the picture here, it is just the 6-piston caliper up front, the 4-piston caliper in the rear. This was not a car that got the new 10-piston in the front, 6-piston in the rear setup. This is, in fact, just the 6-piston caliper in the front. But the rotors are slightly different. So GM talked about the fact that these were the biggest rotors fitted to a Corvette yet, but the size didn't really change so much as the thickness. These rotors are thicker than the Z06 rotors. Size-wise, they're the same. Now, for 2026, this is going to be changed. The rotors are going to increase in size, so are the calipers. But for the 2025s, the braking setup is almost identical to what you'd get on the Z06, minus a slightly thicker rotor. The wheels are also forged in black. They're a slightly different design for the ZR1, of course, but this does still get the Cup 2R tires in the ZTK package setup like the Z07 car would. Outside of that, the only real thing to discuss on the outside of the car is carbon fiber. And we talked about the side skirt a little bit whenever Joe thought it was broken, but luckily that wasn't broken, and none of the carbon fiber had any issues whatsoever. He took a picture of pretty much every bit of carbon fiber on that car, and it all looks perfect. That's right down to the unbelievably massive rear wing. I know you guys have seen it 100 times on my channel here whenever we were talking about the ZR1 down at the bash. I did the same thing by putting my hand in the center of it, and you can see here, this is Joe's hand on the center of that ZR1 wing, and it's insane how big this wing is, especially since Joe, you can weigh in on this a little bit more, but he said that basically he doesn't exactly have tiny hands either. So
yeah, so when I was in high school, I could palm professional basketballs, one in each hand, it's, you know, simultaneously. And so, you know, as you can see in the picture, I'm not even close to the edges of the edge of the wing, which was very surprising.
Yeah, and again, looking at the carbon fiber on the car, the boomerangs look like they line up absolutely perfectly, which is one of the areas of most alignment issues are those boomerangs. So this particular angle that Joe took of this picture of the boomerang here, you could see everything just lines up absolutely perfectly. Very, very nice attention to detail, of course, from GM. But the car just plays very well with the Seawolf gray exterior, all that carbon fiber going on. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a ZR1. So what you're getting here is an incredible piece of machinery with a ridiculous amount of horsepower, an awesome awesome amount of carbon fiber, but at the same time, price difference, roughly 100 grand. Would you buy a ZR1 or a Z06?
I don't track cars, honestly. So, I'm probably not your best person to answer that from a track perspective, but from a non-track perspective, and again, with just very little experience, having not broken in the engine past 500 miles, I will tell you that, driving the Z06 on, say, Sports 6 or Sports 5 or 7 on the solar controller, I felt more exhilarating than I did the ZR1 stock. Now, I may think very differently, doing 90 or 100 and punching it to 130, 160. So I'm not here to represent that at all. But anyone who has added the solar controller experience, whether it's the base car or to a Z06, has used the term, it really wakes up the car, or better said, unleashes that power that's really there. And so I have no doubt that adding that to the ZR1 would also do that around town and do it where that flat spot that most Corvette owners always talk about, it is there in the ZR1 as well. It truly is. Having said that, you're going to get through that spot and, you're going to enjoy 1,064, and that won't be a big problem for you. But it still is there. And that was a little surprising to me as well, when you think of having such a beast on your hands.
Yeah. All right, guys. So that's pretty much it. That is the first initial thoughts and impressions of the pickup with the ZR1 from Joe. So let's give Joe a big thumbs up. Let him know that you appreciate him coming on the channel here and giving us his initial thoughts and impressions on a brand new C8 ZR1. Joe, thanks for coming on the channel and letting us know how you felt about the car. And I guess we'll see you soon.
All right. Always appreciate it. And thanks, Justin. Have a great day.
You too. You guys,
Bye-bye.
Stay obsessed.